Ladies and gentlemen, today I wanted to make a sequel video to the Supercar or Introduction to Supercar video that I made. It was a 1 hour special, a lot of information on actually purchasing supercars, but I feel as though I didn't really make a very good analysis on who should buy a supercar and why and so on and so forth, not really make a case for a supercar. And I think that's kind of the point of the video. The point of the video is really to engage people that already know what they want and that are kind of interested in getting one, right? Let me adjust my camera here. So I think that's kind of what I'm gonna go for today. Is basically go step by step and explain, who should buy a supercar, why, how, and so on. So you could think of it as like a prequel video of the first video, and really what I'm trying to initialize in you guys, the viewer, is to break the Forza Horizon fantasy that you have in your head. Buying a Ferrari Enzo or an FXX, and then just going racing on the highways. The reality of it is much grittier, but in fact I would argue, is much more satisfying. You will find a lot more satisfaction getting an actual supercar in your life than to just LARP about it on the internet and just pretend that you do have that kind of lifestyle. Getting the lifestyle is much better than just pretending that you do. So it's really a video about the post Forza Horizon red pill. Red pilling you guys to get ready to actually enjoy your life as a car guy and as a supercar guy. So let's start with a bit of background. So who am I? I'm really just a hobbyist car guy. I made Track Bro as kind of a rant slash guide channel, and later on I will be having some project cars and showing off some basically vlogs and things like that. And I also like the POV scene of track driving, but also some street driving. I like that a lot, and I think that the collection of cars that I'm accumulating right now might be very interesting for you guys. So I'm a hobbyist car guy. I grew up with hot rod mags and playing Forza 4. Still my favorite Forza by far. And currently I'm basically an Assetto Corsa guy. Like I play a lot of Assetto Corsa, but I've also done drift car days, and I used to hoon around in the streets with my little Miata. So my Miata looked a lot like this one in the picture here. But yeah, I've done Mustang track days at my local track, and I have a Assetto Corsa account. I play GT3, things like that. I've been pretty black pilled by the car community. I started off as kind of like a noob. I didn't really know what was going on. I don't really have a background in cars. Like nobody in my family was, well, close to my family, was really into cars that much. And I've seen really the worst of the car community. We're talking like pure fantasy driven people that are kind of on the spectrum and think that you can have sex with your car, for instance. Or I've seen anime fantasy videos and all kinds of stuff. I mean, like with gamers as well, like a lot of gamers nowadays are just absolutely disgusting in the things that they like. And I've seen a lot of people that suffer from a lot of disabilities that cause them a lot to regress in life. So, for instance, going from making 40 grand a year to basically just living at home with your grandma and thinking that in the future you can afford a Hellcat. And I think that's really sad in the community. But I think there's you can make an effort to become a better person, and I think that everyone deserves a nice car. I know nowadays people don't believe in that. They think that we should just drive battery cars, but I think that there is a case to have in terms of the freedom that you get with a car, and also in terms of what kind of responsibility a car gives you and what kind of person you become as more you drive a car. And I think that those benefits outweigh the negativity and the degeneracy that has been created in the car community. I mean, if you look at like YouTubers right now, they're talking about the car drama and car supremacy. People talking about, oh yeah, I prefer this car and that car. I don't even think that's the problem in the community, right? Like you can prefer Mustangs and shit talk on Camaros and things like that. That's totally fine. I think the real issue is when the people that are shit talking Camaros don't own any car. I think that's an actual issue because you're not driving, the car economy at all. You're basically just talking, you're just talking for talking. So I think that's really the issue here, and I've been really blackpilled on this topic. And you can add me on Steam. I'm American Keisuke or Americad Keisuke, or sometimes Ameri Keisuke. That's kind of like my username right now. And sometimes I'll be like Track Bro Sean and things like that. But yeah, like I really grew up with hot rods like this one. This is really my first love car here. I found it a couple years back, and it's a Pontiac Torpedo Coupe, and it's been dropped quite significantly. I mean, these wheels are like 14 inches on a really large, inline 8 era car. And I mean, when I saw that, I immediately fell in love. I mean, it was really, really cool. And to be honest, it's completely stock. There's nothing on this that is like truly like heavily modified. It looks pretty stock. So let's start with the first question here. It's who should own a supercar? That's really the first question anyone should ask themselves is, should I own a supercar, and who usually owns a supercar? And the first thing you gotta note is obviously supercars are very expensive, and that means that you need a big income. Let's give some examples here. Let's say you're a regular guy and you're like, you know what, I feel like I want to afford a supercar right now. The regular guy is making about 40 to 60 grand. Well, let's look at a normal supercar. Normal supercar would be, this Ferrari 458. It's a beautiful car, Italia, quintessential supercar right here. Well, it started at $240,000 in 2009. So how many times over will you have to pay this thing until you can actually pay it? Well, it'll take you close to 30 years. So that's not very realistic. Now let's look at something that's a little bit more on the reliable side, but still very good looking and a little newer than a 458. 458 is a little old. Obviously, people are going to want it more. Let's look at a Huracan. They're still selling Huracans for the most part. Well, the MSRP for that one was 288, and right now it goes for around 240 grand to 600 grand. So that's not really affordable either. How do you get into that? Well, obviously, to start with, you need a bigger income than that. You cannot be the average guy and think that, hey, listen, I'm going to be able to afford these things. You just forget about it. You're going to have to you're going to have to sacrifice some of the supercarness, or you're going to have to change your mindset on what you can afford and what you should get. So the second thing is that even if you had a big income, like say 300 grand, 600 grand, something crazy, you're going to get slapped by the tax guy. And so that's very, very dangerous, is getting in that situation where you own a supercar, you're able to own a supercar until the tax man comes in and taxes you 50%. If you're making 300 grand, you get taxed 50%. I mean, say goodbye to your car. You're not going to be able to afford a car, especially a supercar, especially if you have to pay for condo fees or housing fees or your girlfriend or whatnot. It's just not going to be feasible. So it's not just about a big income. It's also about being able to min-max your taxes, being able to put money on the side and use that money later on to buy that supercar you want. The third thing is obviously you got to make sure you got storage. So a lot of people, they think you could just daily drive a supercar and, no problem. And even if, you got to fix them at the car mechanic, it's not really a big deal. You got the money for it. Let's say you did, like $1 million. The problem is that you're going to really hinder that value of that supercar, right? You paid $250,000, and the first 3 months of the car, it already has scratches. You already messed up some of the rims. Some of these rims are 12 grand per rim, times 4. Some people, they buy McLarens and then they scratch up the carbon fiber. Do you know how much carbon fiber is? It could be 40 grand, 50 grand for a single piece of carbon fiber. There's 60 pieces on that car and things like this. So it's very important as a car guy and a supercar to be a responsible owner, and for supercars, it's really important that you have the storage for them. You can't just drive them all around town. It's just not something anyone does, and we'll talk about that a little later. You have to really get into that mindset that supercars are assets. So an asset is like a house, is like a business, small business, let's say. they're they're literally objects or cars that appreciate in value, that will actually gain you some value. And when you start thinking of it that way, it makes a lot of sense why people that are not necessarily the richest in the world still buy supercars, right? They're assets. You can look at how much they're going to appreciate over time, just like a house, just like a condo, and so on and so forth. And it actually kind of starts to make sense for a lot of people to buy a supercar, you know? Now, if you are someone that is in the situation where they can start building an asset collection, then I suggest looking at auction and become an auctioneer. An auctioneer is basically someone that watches auctions, looks at pricing, and starts to look at cars as an economy, just like real estate agents do it, just like economists, I guess, financial advisors, and obviously people that accounting. Sorry, I do my own accounting. That's why I forgot that word. So when you look at it that way, it starts to make a lot of sense of owning a supercar. Now, who shouldn't own a supercar? I think that's pretty important because I made it very clear who should, but sometimes it's hard to notice who shouldn't. So in this situation here, really let's start with the worst of the worst here. Beginner drivers, people that have really only driven a handful of hours or days or even years on the road, and have this kind of misconception that you could just buy a supercar and do exactly the same thing you can do with your mom's Toyota Camry or your mom's minivan. That's just not real. A lot of these people also, I find that they have this misconception about everything, right? You're talking about like, you know, muscle strength, sports, confidence, sexuality, values. They really don't have that many values to speak for. They're usually very young, and they kind of have that tendency of just believing whatever's told, right? They look at Mr. Beast with his Lamborghini Huracan. They're like, this is what I'm going to buy later on. And to be honest, you have to be really careful with these people. If you're hanging out with these people, if you are able to notice that some of your friends are like that, it's possible you're like that too. And there's some things you're going to have to change inside before you can actually start living this world and developing yourself. A lot of these people end up being trust fund babies. They're basically kids or young adults that have a tendency of not really thinking economically, thinking what is money, how does money work, how do you buy a house, why do you get a job, how can you get a job, and also why should you get a high paying job. They're not even able to conceptualize these ideas, and the reason is that, you know, as a kid, you know, they had all the money in the world, very rotten, like spoiled kids, and they have generally a tendency of thinking, well, it's okay, my mom or my dad is going to pay for it. Now, if you see yourself like that, you know, if you have the newest console or the newest TVs or whatnot, you got to make sure that you notice that and you say, hey, listen, I got to change something in my head before I can go out and start buying supercars or really anything in life. There's something wrong with you right now, and you're going to have to fix that before you can actually go in the world and live like a normal person, right? Not everyone has that golden lottery ticket, and it's okay if you do. I'm not saying it's bad. You know, your parents probably worked really hard for that, but you have to understand that you have to work. Have to help your parents, and you have to help your bloodline by actually trying to make these things happen for you. And supercars could be that thing. You can enjoy supercars and make money off of it. That's something that a lot of people don't understand, right? People that buy Toyota Camrys, Acuras, and things like that, they buy those cars and they think, okay, well, I paid 30 grand, but in 3 years I will have only lost 20 grand. Well, guess what? With supercars, it's the opposite. They're appreciating assets just like houses and things like that, and they could be really worth it because look, I'm driving something nice, I'm driving something exotic, I'm enjoying myself, and in the meantime, I'm either not losing any money or I lost a very small amount of money, let's say 10 grand. I mean, that's worth it for a lot of people. And another type of person I noticed, and this is really with the beginner drivers, trust fund babies, and just people generally speaking that have like very shallow thoughts. They literally want the supercar because they like the look of it. And I'm sorry to break your bubble here, but with supercars, they're actually really hard to drive. Some of them, you know, if you look at some older supercars like a Lamborghini Diablo, for instance, these things are incredibly piggish to drive. They're not fun to drive, actually. They hurt your legs when you're driving the manual. They're, they burn up clutches. You smell the clutch fumes, and they're just not going to drive like a limousine or a Mercedes S-Class. That's just not a thing. So you kind of have to understand what you like. Again, beginner driver don't understand that, and then figure out if supercars are meant for you, right? Some people, they don't buy supercars, they buy, Ford Raptors and things like that, and that's because they like the look of it, some of it, but most of it is the performance, the comfortability, and where they're going to drive it around, right? In mud, off-road, and things like that. So I would say, if you're one of these people and you just really don't care about what I just said, you really don't have a conception about these things. Maybe you drive this Kia Forte Coupe and you think you're the coolest guy, or maybe you drive this Ford Mustang EcoBoost with your orange painted rims and things like that, and you think that like a supercar is just going to drive the same thing but just better. Then I think to burst your bubble, to truly like understand what's going on here, is to rent or lease it instead. Once you understand how much the insurance costs just to lease it or rent it, or just how much it costs per month for these businesses to break even with these cars, only then will you understand really what a supercar is. And I think that's good knowledge for everyone, or good experience for everyone, just renting or leasing a supercar instead of buying it all out right away. So let's start with a pretty hard question for some beginners, but for a lot of people it's kind of normal. And it's a pretty nerdy question if you think about it, but it's kind of important that we set these rules, these definitions when we start the videos here. So what's a supercar? Now, I want you guys to understand that really what comes down to it, a supercar is a car that is super. And that means that it takes the big performance parts, the big parts that make us excited and happy and high adrenaline, and it brings it up to 11. So that means big power. That means low weight. That means big tires, big rims, big brakes, big suspension, right? Not just big in the sense of large, but also in the sense of how they designed it, how they engineered it, and how that works. And I think that big power is only one part of it, because again, you could get yourself a big turbo Hyundai Veloster, huge tires, such big tires that you really need to get a wide body kit and things like that. We'll talk about that in a sec here. And getting a huge wing, and that still wouldn't be a supercar. And that's because you'd be missing a couple other things, such as corner speed, when you're actually turning the car. Some of these wide body cars, they're just not made for that, right? They're actually made to just look pretty, and usually that's why we call them ricey. A lot of these, I consider this Veloster very ricey personally. And I think a lot of people think they're still supercars. They think, well, listen, I'll just buy a 10 grand Veloster, I'll put, $2,000 turbo and eBay or whatnot, Rotrex, supercharger, doesn't matter what it is, and it's okay if it, my car doesn't really work that way. I'll just put a wide body, put huge tires, and boom, it'll start driving like a supercar. And I think they don't understand fundamentally what a wide body kit is, or what suspension is, and things like that. And I think they have to understand that this is how you make a wide body. You're literally taking plastic, putting a bunch of glue on it, and hoping to hell that your tires aren't going to rub on it, because once they rub on it, well, there you go. It's just going to fly out in the wind. Your wide body kit, it's going to look very ugly. It's going to take a while to get the paint right. A lot of people, they don't even care about the paint. They just wrap it up. They just wrap it with basically with shrink wrap and heat it up to make sure that it just goes flush with the body kit. And usually these people, they think they could just do it on their own, and that's utterly wrong. You cannot do it on your own. For a really long time, I thought that too. I thought, hey, listen, I'll just buy an RX-8. I'll put in a 3-rotor, what do you call those? A 3-rotor rotary engine, and put a big turbo if I want, 700, 800 horsepower. I'll just be like Rob Dahm. Well, there's a reason why Rob Dahm has been doing this for 10 years, and he still has no real supercar to speak of. The RX-7 is still in the works. He still hasn't made any good videos about it. There's no Top Gear review of it. None of that. They basically still have just a test bed of random rotary stuff. So that's something you really got to make sure you're not doing. This is like the Forza fantasy, right? You look at Forza and you're like, hey, listen, in Forza it's a $5,000 upgrade to get a wide body, and boom, I get 3% better acceleration in corners and things like that. And you're like, wow, okay, I should do this in real life. That's just not how it is in real life. In real life, you gotta build it from the ground up to make a supercar. That's the truth. And another aspect is that these cars are usually race ready, right? You build it, you usually not build it, you buy it out of the factory and it's already race ready. That's what I mean, sorry. So in cases like, for instance, this really beautiful Subaru WX STI, completely rebuilt for track, I mean, there is a case, an argument to be said that it is a supercar, but I'm going to have to uh, deduct a lot of points because, again, from the factory, it's not really a supercar. Resale value, it's not really an asset. It'll actually cost you a lot more in repairs and things like that than the actual car's value. And generally speaking, it's more for the track and not so much for the street. Now, you can build a sports car that is just as fast as your average supercar, or 90s to 2000 supercar, but it's just not going to be the same experience, and that's really where you got to think of it. Last aspect is prestige and exotic points. So prestige basically means you got an emblem that people respect. You can show up at a board meeting, let's say, and people will look at your car and say, that's a beautiful car. You stand out even with the best of the best, the German luxury sedans and things like that. You still stand out of those. If you pulled up with a Subaru WX STI, Type RA replica build or whatnot, big turbo, whatnot, and you sat beside these German luxury cars, you would look like a redneck. You'd look like a subhuman that's trying to kind of hang out with the big boys. You would not be your American Psycho type guy. So you got to be careful with that. And finally, exotic points. Exotic points is one of a kind points. Things that you look at your car and you say, listen, I got 6-pot big brakes. I got a big supercharger. They only build like 50 of these and so on and so forth. And I got very rare color. And this is why like a lot of Corvette guys, they like their supercars. They like their Corvette GTs. And I would argue that the Corvette C7 Z06 is really one of those supercars that we should argue for. And that's because it has so many aspects of it, from the wide body kit, from the carbon fiber, from the fiberglass body, from the all aluminum chassis and things like this. And also the supercharger, huge supercharger out the factory, carbon ceramic brakes as an option. All of these aspects, I believe, make it enough exotic points and enough power and so on and so forth that I would argue that's a supercar. That's kind of your baseline supercar, first supercar. So that's what a supercar is in the end. So now let's kind of go through like how to build a supercar. I think this is pretty important for anyone that is watching this video. It doesn't matter who you are, if you've driven supercars or whatnot. And it's really to understand what are the exotic points. What are the points that make a supercar super over a regular car? So the first thing is chassis. From the ground up means you start from the very basics, is the components that you use from the beginning. So for instance, a lot of supercars nowadays use carbon fiber chassis, and we have a picture of that right on top there. And this material is extremely fragile when it first starts. It's really just fibered weave, but once it is weaved up and it is heated up, it becomes one of the strongest and lightest materials on the planet. And it's actually very hard to work with it because although it's a very strong material, because it is weaved carbon, literally weaved carbon, it's only strong in some aspects, in some rotations than others. And so when they're building the chassis, they gotta really engineer it to the maximum to make sure that every weaved component is in the right direction, in the right place, so that when you have crash testing or hitting a corner at really high G's, that it doesn't completely destroy the mold, right? You could imagine just like a paper leaf getting stretched out and completely breaking. That's exactly what would happen if they built these chassis really not very strong. Same thing can be said for aluminum, forged aluminum, and materials like that, which we used to use a lot more back in the day. With supercars, I've noticed that a lot of them will use aluminum, but they will use the strongest kinds of aluminum. And really the strongest you could think of is forged one-piece aluminum. When you see that in supercars, it's a sign of extreme exotic material. We can also look at like luxury cars like Bentley, for instance. They have pretty much everything in the interior is one-piece aluminum pieces, and that is an extreme sign of prestige. Some cars that are a little cheaper in this category will have an all aluminum chassis, but it will be a glued aluminum chassis. And these cars could have the same performance as your carbon fiber chassis, but it has to be done right, it has to be engineered right. An example of like not so good engineering was the Mercedes SL class that came out a couple years ago, 2013ish. That one had a really impressive one-piece aluminum body, but because it was not really engineered for a supercar, it really failed a lot of the tests that people were trying out with them. And again, it's a convertible. You can't really shame it for not being a good supercar, but this is kind of what you got to watch out for when you're buying one of these cars. The performance of even the tiniest details, such as the chassis. Another big aspect of supercars is an exotic engine. Now, I'm not saying all supercars have exotic engines. Just look at the Hennessy GT, basically having, a Corvette, a $60,000 Corvette engine in it. But it's about how they engineered that piece, the engine, in such a way that gives life to the rest of the car. Like, for instance, there's many Corvettes that have very exotic engines. So here we have a good example of that. It's a C401, and it was an engine built by Lotus. It's got very interesting long tube intake system that was really built from the ground up for that specific Corvette. And it's really the only C4 Corvette that ever appreciated in value ever, really. Everything else has just become trash because, again, there's nothing that separated them from the C5s and the C6s and so on. Another aspect is the GT3-esque suspension. So what I mean by that is that the suspension in regular cars is really just a spring with a bunch of rotation points with the chassis, and that's pretty much it. And so they all kind of mold together. And another thing is that to cheapen the suspension, what they do is they have suspension kits. So for instance, here this big wide picture of a suspension is really the Mustang suspension, and that they've been using for years. Now this one is a solid rear axle, so they've been using it from the 80s or even 70s all the way to mid to late 2010s. And the solid rear axle is a very smart suspension, very well built. It's got a lot of advantages, but if you think about it, it's really just a shock, two springs, a solid rear iron piece, steel piece, brakes, and a differential. And everything else is just, to sustain this architecture of suspension. And guess what? It's got so many other parts. It's really a package, and it's a package deal. When you look at how they build it in the factory, it's built by one line of builders, and then they can add it up to the other car. That's why we call track Mustangs like parts bin Mustangs. It's really because they take parts from other bins and they put it up. They put the best parts they could think of and build at a high bandwidth manufacturing standpoint, and you end up with these really cool packages, but not very exotic at all. Actually, very basic. Versus with modern day supercars, we use very high end suspension, whether it's rear wishbone suspension, which unheard of for the most part in regular cars, or they will use also pushrod suspension. So here we have an example of pushrod suspension, and we can see the advantage right away. You can make the car much lower by putting the spring and the shock all inside a horizontal piece, and you can also put the engine on the bottom of that. And again, a lot of supercars have done this. Even track cars and hypercars have done this strategy. So that's a very smart way of building suspension, but it's very hard to build because you need these parts to be very, very solid. Versus a solid rear axle, you don't need to do that. You just need to forge up a strong beam, and that's about it. And then there's other aspects of the exotic points that I would argue. Oh, and I forgot to say, we have brakes. So Bugatti has built some of the biggest brakes they've in the world, and you got how many pots you got on the brake, basically how many pressure points you have, how large the brake is, how what kind of material they use the brake, and also if it's drilled, slotted, if it has wind points, things like this. All that creates very strong brakes, and brakes that are very expensive to build, but again, that are one of a kind. And all supercars pretty much have a trick up their sleeve, whether it's the Ferrari Enzo with the beautiful naturally aspirated V12, whether it's the 458 that has a naturally aspirated V8 and it has an all aluminum chassis that was very, very rigid for that time. Every supercar has some sort of trick up their sleeve over other supercars, and that's what makes them one of a kind. So finally, the exotic points, hand built, how they had the assembly line and things like that, and also the bespokeness. The bespokeness means an engineering position or mindset that's completely different from everything else. Those are really the extra exotic points that make some of the newer cars really special over some of the older ones, and some of the older cars special over the new ones. And one good example of a car that is not really like on the spec sheet, isn't very special, but because of the manufacturer and how they built it, they are technically supercars. It's the TVR lineup. If you look at a Cerbera, it's not much different from what we have with regular Corvettes, even down to the performance. But with TVR, really how they built the car is what made it very special. And again, aluminum, fiberglass, things like this, but also the engine, bespoke engine, completely one of the most powerful inline six engines they ever built. They had the 60-degree V8, which is incredible engine, sounds like nothing else on the road. And these really little things, minute details that are touched upon and that make it special is what's important with supercars. So now let's talk about a big topic here, built versus bought. A lot of people, again, we're going back to what we were saying earlier, Hyundai, Subaru. A lot of people don't understand that you can build a supercar. It's a thing. It exists. It's just not what you think. So here's a really good example. The Track Mustang online community are really people that are taking their Mustangs, building them from the ground up, basically hot rods, and trying to fit into a race category for the street. Now you could just imagine how much time and effort it takes to build this thing, on top of maybe some money and some tricks that you're gonna have to figure out, basically engineering the car from the ground up in your garage, or of course in your friend's garage. And you could just imagine how incredible this thing must drive on the road. Some of these suspension parts, you open up some of the suspension, let the spring breathe a little, and it might drive really well on the road, and that's incredible, very, very fun. But there's some things that you have to consider here. For one is time versus money, right? You can save a lot of money by getting an SVT Cobra, putting a Vortex supercharger and things like that, instead of building a C6 Z06. But when you use all that time to find those parts at a cheap price, and once you start installing all those parts, it'll cost you a lot of time. And it might cost you a lot more time if there's some restrictions, whether it's budget restrictions or whatnot. So that's something to consider. Another aspect is reliability versus parts price. So in some cases, like for instance German cars, they're not reliable and their parts are very expensive. But with supercars, I find as though you kind of have between reliability and parts price. So what do I mean by this is reliability means that parts don't break, or when parts break, they're easy to fix. That would be the reliability aspect. Parts price means how much it actually costs to buy from the OEM. So I'll give you a couple examples. If I bought a C6 Z06, a regular one, I would get big steel brakes. But if I get a Z07, then I will buy with carbon ceramic brakes. Now, in this case, the steel brakes are the reliable aspect. They're cheap, but they're pretty reliable. But when they break, it's actually hard to take out and to change. So that's something that you have to consider. Versus with this carbon ceramics, they're very expensive, 20 grand or so. But when you do have to change them, they're actually very easy to take out. They're two-piece, and once you take out the piece, very expensive, but again, very easy to do on the track, let's say. So that's reliability versus parts price. Another example is if, like, say, I build a trick SVT Cobra, and I realize, hey, listen, I need a different pulley. I could build my own pulley, right? I could do it out the factory. It's not even very hard. You ask your friend to carve out a steel pulley, and there you go. But once that breaks, you're going to have to do it again and again and again. And it's more likely to break because there's no one really testing it. So that's the reliability versus parts price aspect. Yeah, I might have to buy a new pulley from, let's say, Texas Speed or whatnot. But buying it also gives me the peace of mind that other people have tested and made sure that it's reliable. So that's how you should look at that. Then you have resale value versus upfront cost. So for instance, I could get a C6 Z06, build it for the track. It'll be even really easy to do. Really small things are needed for the C6 Z06 to become an absolute track monster in its class. But when I'll try to resell it, it'll be worth less than the parts I put into it and the upfront cost of the C6 Z06. It's a very cheap car nowadays, very cheap supercar. But once I start putting mods in it, people want it less. Versus if I just got a C8 Z06 from the factory with the warranty, and so on, the price would be very expensive. But if I wait a couple years, it'll become an asset. I'll actually make money off of it, most likely, especially with the Z07 package. I mean, these things are rare and very beautiful, and people love them for the track. So that would actually make a lot of sense for some people, for, again, that peace of mind. Now, the last aspect is follow the leader versus tricked out. So follow the leader basically means, hey, listen, I buy this car and I'm kind of scared of working on it myself, but I do want to have that experience where I actually put stuff on. So I could get a C6 Z06, or I could get a C8 Z07, and I would build it up, and there you go. I would have really nice car. But some people, they look at that and they say that's not unique enough. I would argue that's not even an exotic supercar. And they would rather build an SVT Cobra because they did it themselves. It's their masterpiece. It's by Sean the Track Bro. And so that's really the difference here, is follow the leader versus tricked out. Sometimes a tricked out car will be worth more than the other cars, the follow the leader cars. Like for instance, some 911 GT3s are worth less than some Corvette ZR1s that are massively built. But again, is that really worth it? Some people say they'd rather the peace of mind. Some people don't want to risk the resale value be worst, and things like this. And really, here I have a good chart of what you should look at for supercars. So the cheapest here, but the least reliable in terms of, you're going to have to change parts, you're going to have to know how to change these parts, would be, let's say, a Track Mustang Online SVT Cobra. Now these things make a ton of power. You gotta put a big cam and feed it, corn juice for it to actually function at this big power. Versus you could get a C6 Z06, which takes, not that much to make the same amount of power. And, you could still run on 93 octane, although E85 would be kind of nice. And, just put a couple mods and there you go. It's ready for it. But you would still have to change the brakes quite often. The brakes are not so good. Z55 shocks are kind of old, and maybe you'd want to update them to better MagnaRide shocks. And again, getting a nice cam on it will be quite nice sometimes. So maybe it's a better option. Now let's say you don't want that either. You want something even more reliable on the track, and something that you could get a warranty on, a track warranty, an actual warranty. That would be a C8 Z06/Z07. Now with the C8 Z07, I mean, it just came out. We're not sure how much it's going to be worth. It might drop in value. It's a Corvette. So maybe you want something that has even better resale value, and that's also made for the track. Well, then you'd have a 911 GT3, GT3 RS, GT3 Touring if you wanted to, even though it would cost you maybe double the price of the Z07. And then finally, on the very the other end of the stick, the exotic end, say you want something that nobody else has on the track, and it's a beautiful car and it runs great, and you really don't have to do anything to it for many years, but you also want something that is pure supercar. I would argue the McLaren 600 LT is probably your baby, and it's already going up in value, even more than the GT3, right? It's almost double the value already. So that's kind of like the spectrum here. So now let's talk about where to start. We're almost done here. It's not missing very much. Do stick with me. I think it's worth your time. So where to start? Well, we already argued that you shouldn't buy a supercar all out. So I think you should start with to get used to shit boxes. Now, what do I mean by shit box? Well, I'm really talking about a car that costs you the least possible. It's literally just cash out the window type money, and that does the most for you. That's most exciting, dangerous, or so on. Getting that adrenaline going in your body. So one that I personally thought about, and I ended up not doing it, but I was ready to do it, is for 10 grand you could build a 200 wheel horsepower pocket rocket as a Miata. The manifestation is the Miata. And the Miata is a really good platform. Oh, sorry. Really good platform because it's easy to put a turbo on. So you just buy a cheap turbo kit, $1,500. You might upgrade the turbo or whatnot, and boom, you got yourself a Miata. Now, what's nice is that with the Miata, you can either learn or you could buy it. So I could buy a Mazda Speed, do a couple chip tunes and things like this, make the 200 wheel horsepower, or I could buy a turbo kit, do it myself, and boom, I got a better deal, and I did it myself. So that might be worth it. If it's not worth it, just get a Mazda Speed. That's kind of the options there. If you want something a little different, a little newer, let's say, you could definitely get a Subaru BRZ, put a cam in it, put a supercharger or whatnot. But the problem is that you're going to creep into the next territory. And the next territory is the $20,000 500 wheel horsepower financed track and drive home car. So this car is a little bit more expensive. You might have to finance it, but you get the niceties that a regular car should have. You know, a Miata doesn't even have sat nav, or it doesn't even have a Apple CarPlay. Of course, you know, you got your big heater dials. That's what you get with the Miata. So in this case, it might be kind of nice looking at some cars that are really easy to mod and that will make a lot of difference on the track. So for 20 grand, here I got a Shelby GT350. Yeah, obviously that's a bit too expensive, but you could just imagine Mustang GT Performance Pack 1 or 2, doesn't really matter, and then putting in Magnum Ryan suspension if you don't have it yet. If it's already there, that's fine. Changing a couple things like intercoolers, gas pump and things like this. Get a tune, potentially get a cam or a Vortex supercharger, and boom, you got yourself a very nice 500 to 600 wheel horsepower car. Another aspect that you could get, now you could get any muscle car to do this, of course, but if you wanted something maybe a little more reliable, or a little nicer on the street, if you say you got winters that are tough or whatnot, I would suggest then getting a Subaru WRX STI. Now, you could technically do that with an Evo 10. You could technically do it with a Focus ST or RS, Golf R, or whatnot. All-wheel drive, turbo, 4-cylinder, manual. That's really what you want. Now, I chose the STI because nowadays they're getting really cheap. You got your 6-pot brakes right from the factory. Same thing with the performance packs, by the way, 6-pot brake, which is really cool. And you get, generally speaking, big tires from the factory. And when you start modding them, there's a large community for it. So it'll be similar to the Miata, how you would do a couple mods and then get a tune from a Subaru mechanic. Or you could get the engine built out from a Subaru mechanic and boom, make the 500 wheel easily. Now with STIs, you got to be careful. They're going to be less reliable than, say, like a Mustang. Mustang, like 500 horsepower with a Mustang is nothing. But it's a lighter weight car and it's all-wheel drive. So in cases like autocross, auto rally, it might be nicer to get the Subaru. You know, some food for thought there. You have to understand that even millionaires don't daily their supercars. That's the truth. You know, a lot of people I know that are, very high net worth, have the money for the supercar, they'd rather not do it. Because when they buy the supercar, it becomes an asset. And now they can't have as much fun with it than before. Some people consider that. Some people don't really care. Some people figure out ways to monetize their supercar. Either they rent it out, they go to car meets that people actually pay money to bring your car. They do photo shoots, whatever kind of photo shoot, and so on and so forth. And that way they're able to enjoy the car and still make money off of it, which is cool. But it's important to understand that the only way you're going to be able to enjoy a supercar is if you've actually driven normal cars, normal shit boxes. The shit boxes, you'll be able to go slow car fast. You'll be able to understand suspension geometry and, cornering and, hustling the car, especially when you get those muscle cars, bruisers, where you actually got to hustle the tires and make sure that you got that tire tread running properly. And generally speaking, once you're going to get into the supercar, you're going to be able to enjoy yourself that you no longer have to do that. You'll actually notice the performance niceties. This is something that most people don't even do on a regular basis with their regular cars. Then afterwards, you're going to have to build experience. So experience is joining your local racing. Any kind of racing is better than no racing. This is something that Drift King taught me in his interviews and so on and so forth. He truly believed that you could race anything at any time and have fun with it, and that will allow you to build that kind of intuition that you need, that instinct for racing. So whether it's circuit racing, autocross, auto rally, go-karting, or even RC, any of these possibilities will allow you to actually build that intuition, the instinct that you need. So finally, and that's really the last step, you got to make sure you got all those steps figured out first, that mindset and so on and so forth, the experience. Then you can start looking for budget supercars, right? Some people, they want to just buy a supercar all out. Well, you're probably not going to have the money, you're not going to have the time, and you're not going to have the mindset. That's not going to work for you. You got to have all three of them. And the truth is that, watching the first video, you'll learn a lot about budget supercars. But here's three off the bat that I saw right away. You got Lotus Elise S, which got the supercharged inline 4. You can modify the supercharger, put a bigger one, boom, you got yourself basically an Exige. You got, and that's 30 grand. For 20 grand, you can get a very nice Mercedes CL class, a CL 63, 65, whatnot. And finally, it's really important to make sure what budget means. Understand what money is worth, understand the supercar economy. So I suggest looking at potentially buying small magazines, $5, $10, $12, such as Autobuy. Sometimes they used to have like Haggerty price guides, which were kind of nice because you got to kind of see what's worth it. But also just looking on your own. I look at Auto Trader, Kijiji, Facebook Marketplace, Car Gurus, and sometimes I'll look at other markets such as European and Mexican markets sometimes, and that helps you understand also what's it worth it worldwide. And I'll do that for all my favorite cars, but whenever I find a good deal, I just think about what I could do with that. And if it doesn't work out, if I don't buy it, that's okay, because the next time around I'll have more knowledge about cars. I'll have more knowledge about how much they're worth and how much they're worth to me, right? That's very important. Oh, I forgot to talk about also the SVT Cobra. If you get an 03 SVT Cobra right now, 15, 20 grand, you're going to make a big profit in a couple years. So thank you, and keep in mind, if you're broke, get a super bike.